I've been asked a few times how the rice crop has done this year, so I thought I'd do an update. Now, last year we grew Duborskian, which is a Ukrainian upland rice, so not a true paddy rice. It'll grow in dryish land, and that did very well, grown in buckets, and we grew some indoors as well. Both of them did well, both of them put on really good seed heads. So we put that out this year as a trial crop in the paddy. It's done nothing at all. They put lovely plants, they came on really strong, and then it just failed to put a seed head on at all. Now, there's two variables when it comes to getting a good crop out of rice. One is the photo period, so the hours of darkness relative to the hours of daylight that triggers flowering. Last year it did very well in the greenhouse, which has got the same light period, the same photo period as the plants outside. So that shouldn't be an issue, or we didn't think it was an issue. Even in the greenhouse this year, the Duborskian hasn't done a thing, and it hasn't done a thing in the paddy. Let me show you this. We've had a very wet few days, so the water in the paddy is higher than it normally is. So I'm just dropping the water out there, and that's coming out just into the wetland filter. See it just coming in the corner there. Now, it grew up really nice early in the year, looked fantastic, but it just never put a seed head on. It produced these lovely plants, and then they just stayed here as just grasses with no seed head at all. So why hasn't it done well this year, considering that we got seed out of it last year? Well, the other variable is temperature. If it's just not warm enough, it's not going to work, and it varies, different temperatures for different varieties of rice. I'd hoped a Ukrainian rice would do well this far north. It just hasn't. So the plants that we've grown indoors as a sort of insurance policy in case that the stuff outdoors didn't work, we've got the seed from it, so we do have the variety as viable seed, but we're probably not going to do much with that next year. What we're going to try next year is the Hayayuki. Now, the Hayayuki rice is a Japanese lowland variety. It prefers to grow in a paddy field. It really likes wet conditions. Because we got a paddy field, we'll give it a go. And that has done superbly well. The insurance policy ones that we put on the windowsill have done incredibly well, but also the ones in the greenhouse have done well. So we're hoping that the photo period issue won't be one. And it's meant to be pretty cold tolerant. That's the reputation that it has. So with the rice that we've got this year from it, we're going to put in the paddy next year and see how that does. And it'll be interesting either way. We're not necessarily entirely giving up on the Duborskian. We can play around with the different variables like fertility regimes and the timings of it all. It's very, very unknown quantity up this far north. But if we can pull out a good rice crop every 3-4 years, interesting, fun, but not really productive. It's a fair amount of work planting rice because it's got to be grown on and then planted out. It's a lot of work to put into something that isn't reliable, so we probably won't play around with the Duborskian much next year, but the Hayayuki we will. I'll show you the ones in the greenhouse. So this is the greenhouse Duborskian, and it's done no more in here than it has outside. I really thought that it was starting to put on seed heads a couple of times, but it just hasn't amounted to anything, which is really interesting. It's the same soil, it's the same compost mix as last year, it's the same greenhouse as last year, it just hasn't done anything. So there's no such thing as a freak occurrence really. So there'll be a factor, there'll be a reason why last year it did its thing and this one it hasn't. But yeah, it's a little bit disappointing, but it's all data, it's all interesting, and as I've said, with an experimental system you can't expect perfection. Whereas this lot, the Hayayuki, you can see we've got nice seed heads on it that are just starting to turn a nice golden colour now, so they're just starting to mature. So between these plants and the ones that we've got in the house, that's easily several hundred grains of rice. It's a very productive plant. So that will give us enough plants next year to do a full paddy test. The other interesting thing is, even in the house, the Hayayuki, where we've got the Hayayuki rice that's produced seed and we've got the Duborskian that's produced seed, the Hayayuki has put on grain heads weeks ahead of the Duborskian, so it's much earlier than the other variety we've been growing. So that bodes well. I mean, it is very late in the year to be harvesting rice. You know, we wouldn't be harvesting outside at this time of year. It's just getting a bit cold and a bit unpredictable. But it's reliable enough, it's early enough that it's worth experimenting with. It's certainly something that we're going to try again next year, but with the Hayayuki, not the Duborskian. So the ones we've grown indoors, this is the Hayayuki. So you can see some really good seed heads. It's done very well. So that's going to give us plenty of seed. And this is the Duborskian, which is a short grain rice. You can see it's quite a different shaped seed head. But these seeds we're just going to put away as a sort of insurance policy for when we might want to play with this particular variety again. But yeah, I think next year we're going to go exclusively with the Hayayuki in the paddy. So what do we do if next year we try out the Hayayuki and that doesn't really work in a paddy field either, or doesn't do it that reliably? You know, we need to be able to get a decent crop out of it reliably, be worth the time and the effort of bringing it on and then transplanting it. It's very time consuming. The simple answer is we just grow something else. There's a lot of things you can grow in paddy culture. We could switch to the North American so-called wild rice. It's not really related to rice, but grows very similar. It's a slightly different harvesting process. It grows, matures a little bit at a time rather than all at once like a rice. But for a small scale system like we've got here, that's a very resilient way to be harvesting a grain. You know, if you like 10% a week until it's all gone, that's superb. The native people in Canada used to harvest it by going along with open top canoes, bending the plant over and tapping the stalk with, holding the stalk down with a stick and then hitting that stick with another one, and that vibration shatters just the ripe section of the seed head, drops into the canoe, you leave the rest and you just harvest until you've got enough. I'm not going to get a canoe in here, but my point is that you harvest it a little bit at a time rather than the whole crop all in one, which adds a huge amount of resiliency in terms of extreme weather events and so on. So that's a possibility, and it's something that I definitely want to play with in some way over the next few years anyway. But even if that doesn't work, well, what can we go then? We can do duck potato. That's an interesting plant. Ducks love them, which you'd expect from the sound, from the name. That's a possibility. There's a few types of water chestnut that we could play around with. There is, I'll show you. This is Typha latifolia. It's a greater reed mace. Some people call it a bulrush. It's not really a bulrush. That's a different species altogether, but it's a huge amount of biomass. This is the first year it went on. It was this spring that I dug this wetland filter, which takes the overspill from the paddy field. So it's basically here just to clean up the water before it goes down through the soil system and into the crater garden and the other pond system. And this has put on about 4 or 5 feet of biomass this year. It's an amazing plant. There's about 5 or 6 plants went in. You can see how they've spread out, and it's because it's so high, because we've had a lot of rain. The paddy field's been a little bit too high, so I've dropped the water out of that, and you can see that the water's very high. But lower down, below the level of the water, there's a lot of short plants just come out. It shoots rhizomes out sideways, and by next year this will be tightly packed with these plants. And this is an interesting plant. It's well known to survivalists and bushcrafters because it's something that you can extract food from at any time of the year. It's a huge amount of biomass. It's the root is pretty much all edible, and that's a lot of food. You can eat the shoots on it in the spring. You can eat the pollen from the flower heads, which is an amazing golden colour, and you can add that to breads and make it a very high protein bread, as well as adding that really nice rich colour to the dough. You can do all sorts with it. You can weave it into mats. It's incredibly tough. And you can see even with the high winds and this being as high as it is, the ends have got a bit frazzled, but the main mass of the plant is still really healthy. So we could introduce that, and there's dwarf variety as well, but we're not limited for space here. People grow the dwarf ones in little ornamental ponds and things, which, you know, is an interesting option. It's something I might play with eventually. But if all else fails, or, you know, in retirement, and I don't want to be playing around with transplanting annual stuff every year, I could just put a load of this into the paddy field and it'd act like a massive wetland filter. And it'd be probably a few ton of animal feed that is just sitting there doing its thing that I can access and harvest anytime I like. And that's a lot of resiliency to have. So if for some reason animal feed stopped coming into the shops, my animals aren't going to go hungry anytime soon. Now, in the middle of February when it's freezing cold, I'm not going to want to get into a pond and harvest all of this. But with the adjustable monks that I've got on the paddy field, like this one here that I'm using to just drain it currently, where are we? There. So I can adjust these, I can drop the water out the paddy completely. Let's have a look. Put that down a bit further. I think that'll set the water level for the whole paddy. So I can drop the water out of the whole paddy field, and then I can give it a day or so, and it's a fairly resilient plant. It's not going to die for a few days without being immersed in water, and we can harvest as much of it as we like, and we're never going to get it all, so it's all going to come back anyway. So that's a possibility, but as I say, that's the really lazy way to go about it, and it's not, but you know, very resilient, very tough way to grow food, but it's not ideal. I'd rather be eating rice or its equivalent. I like grain. So yeah, it's not the end of the world if rice absolutely fails. We've got a lot of options. So that's the update for the duck and rice system. Not exactly the unqualified success I'd hoped for, but not disastrous either. It's been interesting. We know a little bit more about it now than we did going into it. No one really grows rice this far north, which can be because it's impossible, but you can't necessarily say that. You know, not many people have tried it this far north. So definitely worth trying, and we're still continuing with experiments next year, and probably for a few years beyond that before we can say definitively whether it'll work or not. But yeah, because the rice plants are just coming to the end now. You see they're turning a bit brown. They're not looking their best. So it was a now or never kind of thing with filming it. So yeah, I thought I'd do that update. Another interesting thing, I've got someone in place who wants to buy the rice stalks off me. Now the ones out in the paddy haven't put on seed heads, so they're no good. But after I've harvested the ones from the greenhouse and from the house, that'll give us a certain number of stalks. Now there's a bacteria apparently that lives on rice stalks that is used for a certain type of ferment. So someone contacted us and asked if we'd be willing to sell it, which, okay, yeah, we'll do that. We're not going to ask for much as a nominal thing, because I'm really interested in how that would work, because it's something I hadn't come across before. So it goes to show, even without the rice, we've still got a usable yield of sorts. You know, it's not, I'm not going to retire on that anytime soon. But yeah, so that's the rice update for 2020.